I'm going to say a few things about David Foster Wallace. If you're listening to this, then you most likely know quite a bit about him already, so I can leave out a lot. When he was writing about people, he'd often make up names for them, and I'm going to do that for him. I'm going to call him Rip. It makes me sad to talk about Rip because he killed himself. I'll explain what I mean by sad using one of his examples. He was shooting skeet on a cruise ship, not really knowing one end of the shotgun from the other, and of course he missed, and the bright orange target disc arced out from where it was launched on the ship, curving over the surface of the ocean, declining steadily until it fell into the sea. And Rip said that was sad. It was sad because he'd missed, and it was sad because you could see it in every second of its flight, the inevitable end. And then the end did come, when the tiny bright orange target disc plunged into the vast, seemingly limitless expanse of the ocean, to disappear forever and sink. That was also sad, evoking as it did for Rip, in its brief, uneventful trajectory, the life and death of us all. A lot of things made Rip sad, which is kind of oddly funny because he was known for his humor, and the strangest things enthralled him. Language, all of it, etymology, semantics, grammar, and punctuation, and mathematics were two great swamps in which, especially and nearly inexhaustibly, he liked to play. He'd stay in there long past supper time, when it got dark and you could almost hear his mother calling to him, "Rip, Rip, it's time to come home." Bourgeois, some would say brain-dead, behavior was another one of his favorites. Cruises, state fairs, lobster festivals, political campaigns, porn conventions, TV, Rip was there, on the prowl. When he wrote about these things, he followed his muse. He was not a stickler for the strict rules of nonfiction. He was too impish for that. When he would make things up, he'd call it an authorial postulate. He distinguished himself from the reporters, journalists, and media types who were bound by facts, serving a supposedly unbiased agenda, which meant that they produced coverage that was like tofu, differing only in being soft, silky, or firm. He called what he was doing a hypnotic, sensuous collage and my directionless essayist thing. The exact form of what he was doing emerged in the making of it. He sometimes referred to himself as an anthropologist, a cultural analyst, out on a field expedition, poking about. He was, even more than that, an anthropologist. He was Diogenes with a lamp, looking for goodness. Not somebody else's goodness either. He was searching for that true and unmistakable, unalloyed goodness, sometimes finding it, notably in the play of Roger Federer, or surprisingly in a group of clog dancers, more likely encountering cheap and gaudy imitations, depressing knockoffs of the real thing. Whatever he was examining, he did it thoroughly, a complete assay. Those of you who have read his work will laugh at that vast understatement. Rip gained a measure of fame through his use of footnotes, if it is possible to gain any measure of fame through the use of footnotes. The cuffs and shackles of many a suffering grad student, for him they were a happy device, a way of liberation. In them, he split hairs, he picked at nits, he lectured, he scolded, he counted the number of angels on the head of a pin, and then, in the interest of fairness and completion, and to satisfy his hungry curiosity, he would count the number of devils on the head of that pin. And he did this cheerfully, joyfully, without the strain of effort or the lapse of fatigue. He called it wicked fun. Rip knew full well, the way he knew everything that he knew, that it was too much. But as a guide, he'd have your hand and he'd say, I know, just stick with me, it's not that much further. And you'd go along, even though, having read enough of his work, you'd know there was still a very long way to go. His epitaph could well have been, but I digress. He couldn't help it. There was too much fun and too much to be discovered and revealed in the digressions. As an explorer, Rip would have been a flop. If he'd have been in charge instead of Lewis and Clark, the expedition would have wound up in St. Louis, and Rip would have been in a sanitarium with a full and finely detailed record of everything he'd encountered on his way there. His subjects all blossomed into anthologies. Had he written a play, 80% of it at least would have been asides, and those who attended would have loved it and found it perverse, hilarious, maddening, entertaining, and illuminating. In short, no, make that in length, so like Rip himself. The asides are all fascinating and largely irrelevant, and a total drain on any sense of momentum. Forget plot. The play might have had, but this is not a working out, it's a working in. It's about the thorough explication and investigation of every shred and tangent and tributary of what might once have been the plot. The asides branch out so fantastically that everything comes to resemble a fractal, a kind of branching out into a nervous system, the physical representation of the mechanism of thought itself. The complex structure of the sentences and the whole became his signature. The footnotes were even funnier when they came in parentheses or brackets, or when he appended footnotes to his footnotes. Parentheses were his little confessionals, where he came clean. Footnotes were his deep drills, his doctoral thesis, and he knew it was all too much. Past a certain point, he wrote, impressiveness is corrosive to the psyche. More bluntly, he wrote, I can be kind of a snob and an asshole. He had a troublesome habit of making a choice, coming swiftly to believe it an error, and feeling regret, dissatisfaction, and despair. This could apply to a place to live, a lover, a stick of gum, or a word in his latest writing. He was a Felix with no Oscar for a friend, and to counterbalance him, to keep him from going off the deep end. Rip was the deep end. He started out extreme and simply amplified it, until that's what he was, a great extremity, or as he'd say, a grotesque. He was manic in his writing, depressive in his living, to the point of torture, a lot of it self-inflicted, but you could argue otherwise endlessly about that, and that very argument, around and around, became a central feature of the torture. Rip once wrote a breakup letter to a girlfriend, titling it Breakup Note for Claire, Rough Draft. It was 67 pages long, with 7 chapters and lots of footnotes. She put it aside. He called and asked what she thought about it, so she found it and started reading. She made it to page 20 and gave up, calling it a little self-indulgent. He'd put footnotes in Valentine's he'd sent to her, too. Once he gave her a manuscript of 88 numbered points on why he didn't want a birthday party. He wrote her letters on what he intended to do about processed sugar, why he was going to throw out his TV, and why he wanted to be called Dave. My particular neurological makeup, he wrote, is extremely sensitive. Car sick, air sick, height sick. My sister likes to say I'm life sick. His sister was right. One of my basic goals is to subject my nervous system to as little terror as possible, he wrote. Good luck on that. He carried his terror inside. And when he wrote, it all gets tremendously complex and depressing, he could have been writing about anything. All his roads led him to the same end, despair, the loss of hope, the last candle. Time for me to fess up. I've read most of Rip's nonfiction, not all of it. And I read brief interviews with hideous men, but I did not like it. It may have been brilliant, the critics may have raved, but it was a struggle for me to get through it. I did not read Infinite Jest, or The Broom, or The Pale King, and I don't intend to. Part of the sadness in talking about Rip is that I'm done with him. We're parting ways, and I'll never encounter him again. And I'll miss that. He was engaging in his way. Poor old yours truly, he called himself, and that's what he was, precisely. When he read a seemingly inoffensive puff piece written by one of his former writing teachers, glorifying the wonders of the cruise experience, he was horrified by its dishonesty. Nowhere did it admit that the writer had been paid by the cruise line. It was hired, highfalutin hokum passing his honest opinion. It was, for Rip, a betrayal of the contract between writer and reader. Its dishonesty was especially bad, he wrote, because it makes us wary of even the honest, and makes us feel confused and lonely and impotent and angry and scared. It causes despair. "Aw, lighten up, Rip," you want to say, but he could not. Rip was gravity itself, always bringing things down. Which brings me back to that cruise, and what he wrote about it. It's a well-known piece, like an answering blast to the lurid fluff hacked out by his former teacher, hailed for its humor and satiric bite, but there is much about it that is not funny in the least, that foreshadows his dark end. The ship was called the Zenith. Rip rechristened it the Nadir. He was the last person in the world, possibly, who should have been on that boat, typically alone. The prefabricated, highly processed, fine-tuned, whisper-polished chunk of fun meant to simulate paradise on earth was hell on water for him. The ever-smiling staff, tyrannized by the martinets who ran the ship, made it feel for him like a floating concentration camp. The conjunction of the mass-market pleasure experience, the ceaseless pampering with his frayed, neurotic personality was absolutely mortifying. The chit-chat at tables, the sight of aging flesh, the bovine behavior of the patrons, the stabs at entertainment, the glut of food, the ship itself, deck piled on deck, and most of all the ocean, made it worse and worse, intensifying revulsion and guilt. And the confinement. Rip called himself a semi-agoraphobe, and he stayed in his cabin, avoiding the nightmare, documenting every last inch and screw and suck of the toilet. But on the ship, on the sea, the tables were turned, and it was Rip who was locked in. And there he was, on the cruise, wanting to die in order to escape the unbearable feeling of becoming aware that I'm small and weak and selfish and going without any doubt at all to die. The mouse in the Kafka story. At the start of the cruise, some passengers spoke about a young man who had jumped off a ship in the middle of the ocean and had been lost at sea. Rip didn't jump on his cruise. He had a manuscript to deliver, but he was lost at sea, like that tiny bright orange target disc. Fitzgerald, who did not kill himself, but who by his own admission cracked, said something about the hallmark of a great mind being its ability to hold two completely separate views of one thing and still be able to function smoothly. Rip did that all the time. He had second thoughts on everything, thirds and fourths. He called it paradox, and said he had a paradoxical fascination, which he assuredly did. It may have been fascinating in his thinking and writing, but in his life it was debilitating, excruciating, and fatal. The ship sails on. Goodbye, Rip.